George sat alone in his small apartment, the glow of the street lamp casting long shadows through the thin curtains. It was nearly midnight, but sleep continued to evade him. This was nothing new. Sleepless nights had become a part of his routine. Ever since his wife had passed away 3 years ago, at 72, George had once led a stable and predictable life. He had spent 40 years working diligently in a finance office, carefully saving for retirement to ensure he could live comfortably. But now, with no job to occupy his time, he felt adrift. His 2 children had moved away to different cities, caught up in the whirlwind of their own lives. They still called, but their conversations were becoming shorter, tinged with the unspoken reality that they were balancing their own responsibilities while trying to be there for their aging father. George's worries weren't just about loneliness. More and more, his days were spent staring at his bank statements, meticulously calculating expenses. On paper, he should have had enough to live without fear, but unease gnawed at him. Prices were rising, medical costs were unpredictable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that one bad turn could deplete his savings entirely. That fear kept him from spending. A dinner out, a new book, small indulgences that once brought joy, now felt reckless, almost dangerous. He wasn't alone in this. Looking around, George saw that his generation was struggling to keep up. The world had shifted beneath their feet. In an economy that seemed to reward the young and adaptable, older people like him felt left behind. Retirement, which was supposed to be a peaceful reward for decades of work, instead felt like an uncertain, precarious phase. It was as if he had built a life around a promise that no longer held true. A few years ago, he had imagined retirement differently. He had pictured himself traveling, picking up old hobbies, enjoying time with friends. But reality had turned out to be starkly different. His days felt repetitive. Mornings with coffee and the newspaper, afternoons filled with small errands, and evenings where the silence of his apartment pressed in on him. Nights were the worst. When the world went quiet, his mind became restless, running through an endless loop of what-ifs. One restless night, unable to sleep, George got up, made himself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The stars were scattered across the sky, a familiar yet distant sight. He thought back to his working years, the structured days, the deadlines, the sense of purpose. He had spent decades preparing for this phase of life, believing that if he worked hard and saved diligently, he would be able to enjoy his golden years. And yet, here he was, feeling lost and unsure. His thoughts turned to his wife. She had always been the optimist, the one who reminded him to enjoy the present rather than worry about the future. What would she say if she saw him like this? Would she tell him he was letting his fears steal the very happiness they had worked so hard for? The thought made his chest tighten. He had done everything right, so why did it feel like it still wasn't enough? The question lingered in his mind, looping over and over like a song stuck on repeat. He wanted answers, but none seemed to come. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on him, making him feel smaller, more fragile than ever before. And yet, beneath the worry, there was a small, quiet part of him that longed for something different, a way to break free from this endless cycle of fear and doubt. He just didn't know how. George took a sip of his coffee, looking across the table at David. It had been years since they had last spoken, yet David looked as though time had treated him differently. He seemed relaxed, at peace, as if the burdens that weighed so heavily on George's mind had never touched him. "You look good, David," George admitted, setting his cup down. "Retirement seems to be treating you well." David chuckled. "I suppose it is. But it wasn't always like this. There was a time when I worried. About the same things you do." George sighed. "It's hard not to. I worked my whole life, saved every penny I could, and yet I still feel like it's not enough. Prices keep going up, health care is expensive, and what if something happens? I don't have a paycheck coming in anymore. It feels like I've lost control. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. I used to feel that way too. Every time I spent money, I felt guilty. I would constantly check my accounts, plan out every expense, but no matter how much I saved, I always felt insecure. Then I started seeing things differently. George frowned. Differently? How? Did you win the lottery or something? David laughed. No, nothing like that. I learned to change my perspective. I started studying Buddhist philosophy, and it shifted the way I think about money. George raised an eyebrow. Buddhism? What does that have to do with financial security? David leaned back, smiling. More than you think. Let me tell you a story. He took a deep breath before beginning. There was once a wealthy businessman who spent his whole life building his empire. He had money, power, and influence, but he was never at peace. He always feared losing what he had. His days were filled with stress, and his nights were restless. One day, on a rare vacation, he met a simple fisherman who lived in a small coastal village. The fisherman caught only enough fish to feed his family and enjoy a peaceful life. The businessman, intrigued, asked him why he didn't work harder, catch more fish, and expand his business. The fisherman simply smiled and asked, "And then what?" "Well, you'd make more money," the businessman replied. "Then you could buy a bigger boat, hire more people, and eventually start a company." "And then what?" the fisherman asked again. The businessman continued, "Then you could expand even further, make millions, retire early, and finally relax and enjoy life." The fisherman chuckled. "But I already do that now. I wake up, fish for a few hours, spend time with my family, and watch the sunset. Why would I need millions to do what I already have?" George listened intently, the weight of the words settling in. "So, you're saying, I've been chasing something I already have?" David nodded. "In many ways, yes. We've been conditioned to believe that security comes from having more. But real peace doesn't come from the amount of money in your account. It comes from how you see it." George frowned. "That sounds nice, but it doesn't change the reality of my expenses. Bills still need to be paid." David held up a hand. "Of course. I'm not saying money doesn't matter. But what I am saying is that fear shouldn't control you. I learned 3 key lessons from Buddhist teachings that helped me break free from that fear." George folded his arms. "I'm listening," David continued. "First, I stopped thinking in terms of scarcity. Instead of obsessing over what I lacked, I started appreciating what I had. When I shifted my mindset from, I don't have enough, to, I have what I need, the anxiety eased." George considered this. "Easier said than done." David smiled. "That brings me to the second lesson. Mindful spending. Instead of hoarding money out of fear, I started using it with intention. I stopped making unnecessary purchases, but I also stopped depriving myself of simple joys." George sighed. "And the third lesson?" David's expression softened. "Generosity. I learned that when I let go of my fear of losing money and gave, whether it was my time, a small donation, or even just kindness, the fear lost its grip on me. And strangely enough, money started flowing back in ways I never expected." George was silent for a moment, letting the words sink in. "You really believe that just changing how I think about money can make a difference?" David nodded. "I don't. Just believe it. I've lived it. And I can tell you, life feels a lot lighter when you're not weighed down by fear." George stirred his coffee, lost in thought. He wasn't entirely convinced, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something other than anxiety. He felt curious. George stirred his coffee again, still processing everything David had told him. The idea that his financial anxiety was more about his mindset than his bank balance was difficult to grasp. He had always believed that security came from having more. not from thinking differently about what he had. David could see the doubt in George's eyes. He leaned forward and said, "Let me explain it another way. Think of every thought and action as a seed. If you constantly plant seeds of worry and fear, what do you think will grow?" George frowned. "More worry and fear?" David nodded. "Exactly. But if you plant seeds of gratitude, generosity, and mindfulness, you cultivate peace and even prosperity in ways you never expected. It's the law of cause and effect, karma, if you will. What we focus on expands." George took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "That sounds nice in theory, but I've spent my whole life working hard, saving, and being careful with money. And yet here I am, still feeling insecure. So what am I supposed to do? Just sit here and hope my problems disappear?" David smiled knowingly. "No, of course not. Shifting your mindset isn't about wishful thinking. It's about making conscious changes in how you approach money. Let me tell you a story." He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. "There was a man who spent his whole life complaining about money. He was always frustrated. He felt he was never paid enough. His bills were always too high, and the world was unfair to people like him. No matter how much he earned, he never felt it was enough. One day he met an old teacher who told him, 'Your problem isn't your money. Your problem is your thoughts about money.' 'That's ridiculous,' the man said. 'If I had more money, I wouldn't have to worry.' The teacher smiled. 'Then why do some wealthy people live in constant fear of losing what they have? While some poor people are content with very little, the difference isn't their bank accounts, it's their mindset.' The man was skeptical, but he decided to experiment. He started practicing gratitude every day, acknowledging what he did have instead of focusing on what he lacked. Slowly, his frustration faded. He found himself making better financial decisions, feeling more at ease, and unexpectedly, new opportunities started coming his way. His career improved, and for the first time he felt truly secure, not because of how much money he had, but because he no longer feared losing it. George sat back, thoughtful. "So you're saying I've been feeding my fears this whole time?" David nodded. "We all do until we learn a better way, but let me break it down into practical steps you can start taking right now." He held up 3 fingers. First, shift from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. Instead of constantly worrying about not having enough, start appreciating what you do have. Every morning, before you check your bank account, take a moment to list 3 things you're grateful for. It could be as simple as having a warm cup of coffee, a roof over your head, or a good conversation with an old friend. When you train your mind to focus on abundance, you begin to see opportunities rather than limitations. George raised an eyebrow. "That sounds simple, almost too simple." David chuckled. "It is simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. Our habits of thinking are deeply ingrained, and it takes practice to change them." He put down his coffee cup and continued. "Second, use money consciously. That doesn't mean being reckless, but it also doesn't mean hoarding money out of fear. Instead of asking, 'How can I save more?' ask yourself, 'How can I use my money in a way that supports my well-being?' Maybe that means investing in experiences that bring joy, or spending on things that align with your values. The key is balance." George sighed. "I've spent my whole life being careful with money. I don't know if I can just change overnight." David nodded. "You don't have to change overnight. But even small shifts in how you think about money will make a difference. That brings me to the 3rd lesson, generosity." George frowned. "That one doesn't make sense. If I'm already worried about not having enough, how can giving money away help?" David smiled. "It's not about the amount, it's about the act. When you give, even in small ways, you tell your subconscious mind that you have enough. It interrupts the fear of scarcity and opens the door for more abundance to flow in. You don't have to donate huge sums. Even small acts of kindness, buying a coffee for a friend, giving to a local food bank, or simply helping someone in need, can shift your perspective and bring unexpected rewards. George sat quietly, digesting everything. He had spent so many years guarding his finances, fearing what might happen if he let go even a little. But David's words made sense in a way he hadn't expected. "I guess it wouldn't hurt to try," he finally admitted. David grinned. "That's the spirit? You might be surprised by what happens when you stop letting fear control you." For the first time in a long while, George felt something other than anxiety when thinking about money. He felt hope. George woke up the next morning, still thinking about his conversation with David. He had spent so many years letting worry dictate his financial choices, and for the first time, he felt a small glimmer of hope that things could change. But how? Later that day, he met David again, this time at a park where the two could walk and talk freely. As they strolled along the tree-lined path, George finally asked, "So, what do I actually do? How do I change the way I think about money?" David smiled. "We'll start with something simple. Every morning before you check your bank account or worry about expenses, take a moment to think of 3 things you're grateful for. They don't have to be big things. It could be the warmth of the sun, a good cup of coffee, or even just waking up feeling well." George furrowed his brow. "And that's supposed to help?" David nodded. Gratitude shifts your focus. Instead of waking up and immediately thinking about what you lack, you start your day appreciating what you have. Over time, this rewires your brain to see abundance rather than scarcity. George hesitated, but then sighed. "All right, I'll try it. What else?" "Meditation," David said simply. "Just 5 minutes a day. Sit quietly, focus on your breathing, and let your thoughts come and go. Don't judge them, just observe." George chuckled. "Meditation? You mean sitting in silence and doing nothing?" "I don't know, David. I've never been good at that sort of thing." David laughed. "You don't have to be good at it. You just have to do it. The point is to calm your mind so you can stop the constant cycle of worry and fear." Skeptical but intrigued, George decided to give it a shot. The next morning, he sat at his kitchen table with a blank notebook in front of him. He tapped the pen against the page, feeling a little foolish, but eventually he wrote down a few things he appreciated: the roof over his head, his health, and reconnecting with an old friend. He looked at the list, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that day, he attempted meditation. He sat in his chair, closed his eyes, and tried to focus on his breath. His mind wandered almost immediately. Bills, groceries, what to cook for dinner, but he remembered David's advice. Just observe, don't judge. After 5 minutes, he opened his eyes. He didn't feel profoundly different, but there was a small sense of stillness that hadn't been there before. As days passed, George continued the practice. Some mornings were easier than others, but he noticed something strange. He wasn't as anxious checking his bank account. He felt more aware of the good things in his life, and he found himself being more present in his daily activities. One afternoon, George was heading back from the grocery store when he saw his neighbor, an elderly woman struggling with her shopping bags. Without thinking, he walked over and helped her carry them to her door. "Thank you so much, George," she said with a smile. "That was very kind of you." As he walked back to his apartment, something clicked. He had spent years worrying about his own security, his own well-being, his own future. But in that small moment, he had stepped outside of himself, and it felt good. That evening, he pulled out his journal and wrote about his experience helping his neighbor. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly light. David's words came back to him. When we stop obsessing over our worries, we start noticing opportunities all around us. Over the next few weeks, George continued his new routine. He reflected on his blessings, meditated each morning, and made an effort to be more present. He even started making small, intentional acts of generosity, donating a few dollars to a local charity, leaving an extra tip for a waiter, or simply smiling at strangers he passed on the street. Slowly, but surely, something shifted within him. His financial situation hadn't changed overnight, but his relationship with money had. The constant grip of fear and anxiety loosened, making space for something new. A quiet confidence that no matter what happened, he would be okay. One evening, he called David. "I think I get it now," he said. "It's not about how much money I have. It's about how I see it. And for the first time, I don't feel afraid." David smiled on the other end of the line. "That's the real wealth, my friend. Welcome to it." One morning, as George sat with his coffee, he found himself staring at his phone, ready to check his bank balance. The familiar feeling of unease crept in. He remembered David's advice and hesitated. Instead of opening his banking app, he reached for a notebook that had been collecting dust on his kitchen counter. He flipped it open and, with a deep breath, wrote down 3 things he was grateful for: the warmth of his morning coffee, the roof over his head, and the fact that he had an old friend like David who cared enough to help him see life differently. At first, it felt silly. George had spent years thinking about money in terms of numbers, calculations, and security. Writing down things he was grateful for seemed insignificant compared to the weight of financial uncertainty. But something about the act of doing it made him pause. He took another sip of his coffee and realized that, for that moment, he wasn't worrying. He was simply appreciating. Later that day, George attempted the second part of David's advice: meditation. He wasn't sure if he was doing it correctly. He sat in his chair, closed his eyes, and focused on his breath. Almost immediately, his mind started racing. Thoughts of bills, expenses, and uncertainties flooded in. But he remembered David's words. Don't fight the thoughts. Just observe them and let them pass. He took a deep breath and focused again. 5 minutes felt like an eternity, but when he finally opened his eyes, he noticed something. He felt a little lighter. Not much, but just enough. Over the next few days, George continued with these simple practices. Every morning he wrote in his notebook, sometimes struggling to think of 3 things, but always managing to find something. Each day he sat quietly for 5 minutes, and while the thoughts still came, he found himself less consumed by them. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was a shift. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, as he walked up to his apartment building, he noticed his elderly neighbor struggling with her grocery bags. Normally, he might have kept walking, lost in his own worries. But this time, without hesitation, he stepped forward. "Let me help you with those," he said, taking a few of the heavier bags. The woman's face lit up with relief. "Oh, thank you, George. These bags are heavier than I thought. You're very kind." As he helped her inside and set the bags down in her kitchen, George felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection. It was such a simple act, yet it felt deeply fulfilling. That night, as he wrote in his journal, he reflected on the moment and scribbled down a thought that surprised even him. "Today, I helped someone without thinking about what I'd get in return. And for the first time in years, I felt truly light." The more he practiced gratitude and meditation, the more he noticed small shifts in his outlook. Instead of dreading each new day, he started to look for small joys. He smiled more at people, in passing. He took time to appreciate the simple pleasures he had once overlooked. The way the sunlight streamed through his window in the morning, the taste of his favorite meal, the laughter of children playing outside. These things had always been there, but he had been too caught up in his fears to notice them.